Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Leonard Pearlstein Gallery of the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today my guest is the novelist Salman Rushdie. Mr. Rushdie is the award-winning author of many novels and stories, including Midnight's Children, which won England's highest literary award, the Man Booker Prize, The Moor's Last Sigh, Shalimar the Clown, and most recently, The Golden House. Mr. Rushdie is also known for his 1988 novel, The Satanic Verses, which Iran's Ayatollah at the time condemned as blasphemous and for which Mr. Rushdie was placed under a fatwah or religious order to be killed, making him spend years in hiding. I have so much to ask Mr. Rushdie about his life and work, and I'm so pleased to have him with us today. Salman Rushdie, welcome to the Drexel interview. Well, let's get the obvious question out of the way at the beginning, which is, I think it's impossible for you to be interviewed without mention of the Satanic Verses and the fatwa that made it necessary for you to be in hiding for several years. I know that that fatwa has been at least partially lifted, if not totally so, and I wonder if you tell us a little bit about your current state of vulnerability.
I think I'm fine, thank you. I mean, it's been really a long time. You know, that the trouble went on for a long time. It went on for 9 years or so, but it's been over for 20 years.
What made it over?
Well, there was a negotiation between governments, essentially, that resolved the issue.
So you feel safe?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I've been living a perfectly normal life for 2 decades, so I think it's really...
You've certainly been out there.
It feels like ancient history to me. Problem is that I keep having to talk about it.
Yes, well, we have to talk about it because people immediately ask about it.
I
In fact, it makes me wonder if you sometimes feel, are you loved for yourself? In other words, you're gifted, your gifts as a writer, or are you loved because of that notoriety or that celebrity that came out of
I
the
think,
fatwa?
you know, that's all gone away, really. And I think it's so long ago that certainly younger people, you know, it's not something that signifies that
You know
much.
it will be in your obituary.
Well, thank you, but I won't be reading that.
Good point. So you were born in India, you were educated in England, and you now live in the U.S., and specifically in New York City.
Yes.
This gives you a hybrid identity of a great sort. Can you tell us a little bit about each of these locales and your sense of them and your sense of connection to them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you know, has been really 3 very big cities in which I've spent most of my life. You know, first in Bombay, now called Mumbai, then in London, and now for the last almost 20 years in New York. And so, first of all, I think it's given me a very metropolitan view of the world. You know, I mean, I think of myself as a writer of the big city. You know, and what's unusual for me is the countryside. You know, so there was at least one novel of mine, which you mentioned, Shalimar the Clown, a lot of which takes place in a small village in Kashmir. And it was a deliberate kind of challenge I set myself to get out of my comfort zone, so to speak, which is the big city, and see if I could create a story credibly, you know, in a very remote environment rather than a cosmopolitan one. You know.
And did you research that? Did you live
in
such
and it's where my family is originally from, Kashmir, so I know it quite well. So, but still, it was a leap. You know, the cities have, you know, great cities have things in common. You know, and I think one of the things that all great cities now have in common is an incredible diversity of population. You know, that people come from everywhere. Bombay is interesting because, first of all, it has the greatest diversity of Indians in it. You know, the other cities, the other big cities in India, are more homogeneous. You know, if you're in Delhi, almost everybody there is from North India. If you're in Calcutta, almost everybody there is Bengali. If you're in Madras, Chennai, almost everyone there is Tamil. You know, whereas in Bombay, everyone's there from everywhere, you know, because it's a magnet. It has the kind of magnetic force of the metropolis, you know. So also because it's the great port on the west coast of India, it also has the largest population of non-Indians. So in that sense, it really is the only genuinely cosmopolitan city in the South Asian subcontinent. I mean, London, in its own way, of course, is very is full of people from all over the place, partly as a legacy of empire. So there are substantial communities from all the places which the British once ruled, like the Caribbean and South Asia and parts of Africa, etc. And now those are multi-generational. I mean, now they're into the third or fourth generations. And then, New York is the world city. You walk down the streets of New York and you meet people from everywhere in the world. So that sense of multifariousness of many cultures colliding in the streets of the city, is something that's always excited me to write about, and makes me feel that people who now harken back to some imagined golden age of purity when the world was not like that.
I guess a pre-industrial time before the urban
yeah,
center.
but I mean, we're not going back there.
Time.
Yes, we're not going back. This is what there is for everywhere now. I mean,
absolutely.
And I think that as a writer, it's helped me to have had this life of bouncing around between these three cities, because it allows me to write about something which I think is important nowadays, which is, kind of how the world joins up, how over here is connected to over there.
It's interesting that you say that, because I mean, all your characters, or most of your characters, have this hybrid element to them. And I would say it's the native place, and then there's the shadow of the colonial, and then there's the global city. And I think that's the betwixt and between among those three identities is what you are. And I also wonder if it's the metaphor or the ideal positioning for the writer.
Well, I think, there's something about writing, certainly a novel, which requires you to be both an insider and an outsider. That you need to be on the inside, otherwise you can't create the world. You can't create the world with sympathy and knowledge. But you also need to have this ability to step out of the frame and look at the picture objectively, critically, from a distance. So I think a lot of the writers that I admire as a reader are people who have that ability to be both inside and outside.
It may help too to be born in a certain position. To have this, what I refer to as hybrid identity, I think makes it a little easier.
Yeah. I think if you have this, certainly the kind of immigrant position, the position of the immigrant writer, that makes it kind of almost natural to have that double vision.
I agree.
And one of the things I think is very interesting about what's happening right now in American literature is this a generation of writers much younger than myself are coming from everywhere. Literally, that's to say, immigration was always important in American literature. There was always, Eastern European Jewish migration, and there was Italian migration, and both those things have been significant for the American novel. But now, there are American writers from really almost everywhere.
Everywhere.
You think about it, there's Junot Diaz from the Dominican Republic, and Jhumpa Lahiri from South Asia, and Nam Le from Vietnam, and Yi Yun Lee from China. And suddenly, and they would all, I think, define themselves as American writers, but they're bringing into American literature the story of the world.
That's so interesting, because I do think that there have been waves of immigrant writers that have taken center stage in American literature up until recently. I mean, as you said, the Jewish, the Italian, Irish, so forth.
Exactly.
And now it's this eclectic.
Yes.
And that's the global.
And it's very enriching, I think, because it brings a whole range of new kinds of story into the American novel. And in a way they're inspirational to me, because reading these young writers, the younger writers, I thought, well, that's me too. I mean, I'm also from somewhere else with bags full of stories,
But you've been doing this a long time.
Yeah, but not here, And so I thought, no, maybe now it's I can do this. I can do what they're doing, which is to unpack these bags of stories and see, kind of throw them at the Empire State Building and see what happens, and see how to accommodate those stories of the worlds that I came from into the stories of the world that I came to.
That's very eloquent. I want to go back a little bit to the beginning of your career as a writer of sorts. You were a copywriter.
Yeah.
This to me is fascinating. I worked on Madison Avenue for a while,
Yes.
and you were at Ogilvy and Mather, I guess, in London.
In London, yes.
And major advertising firm, and you were responsible for some major campaign jingles or whatever.
It's a very long time ago.
You were a
yes.
madman then.
It's very strange that the last season of Mad Men caught up with the time when I had worked in advertising.
Is that so?
Yeah, so just the very last season.
Yeah.
I remember that Coke commercial.
That ends it, where he's
exactly.
speaking the
I
word.
remember it being made, and I knew the agency in which it was done, and so on. So, and I know Matthew Weiner, and I've talked to him about it, and I've said that it's actually pretty realistic.
Do you feel that experience fed into your fiction writing and into your worldview?
Well, what it did a number of things. It first of all, it paid the rent. It took me 5 years to write Midnight's Children, and I needed.
Were you doing it while you were at Ogilvy and
Yes,
Mather?
because I managed most of the time to have a thing which you really can't do anymore, but just to get a kind of part-time job. So I was working 2 days a week, sometimes 3 days a week, and that gave me enough money to live on, but it also gave me 4 or 5 days a week to be a novelist at home. And given that this book took really many years to write, it was incredibly useful.
It's a massive book.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I was, in a way, learning how to write it when I was writing it. I was a young, inexperienced writer. So.
And yet that book, Midnight's Children, which is still a book for which you're very much known. You won the Man Booker Prize for it. It catapulted you into the world of the literary world.
Yes, it did.
Did you expect that to happen?
No, I didn't. I was delighted when I finished it, that it was published by very serious publishers, by Alfred Knopf in America, and Jonathan Cape, which was sort of like the equivalent of Knopf in England. And I thought, oh, well, if they think it's good, maybe it's good. And I just hoped that maybe a couple of thousand people who weren't related to me would buy copies of it.
Obviously they did.
But the idea that it would become this kind of this thing that it became, but first of all that it would end up, becoming an international bestseller and it would be translated into 45 languages and etc. It was impossible to imagine that, and so it came as a great surprise.
Well, I wonder, let's look at why it might have happened. It was about a character born at midnight with a magical connection to others born at the moment of Indian independence.
Yeah.
So what led you to dramatize that juncture and do so in this magical way?
Well, first of all, it's the story of my generation. I'm a little older than him. I'm actually some 8 weeks older than him. I was born in mid-June of 1947, and independence came 2 months later. But essentially, the story of him as he grows up is the story of my generation.
Yes.
And it's an interesting generation because it was the first generation of free people to be born in India and Pakistan for 2.5 centuries. But it's also a transitional
What a
generation.
wonderful metaphor, or what resonance you have from that idea.
Yeah. And also it's a transitional generation, because the thing about an empire, about colonialism, is that it doesn't end on the day the colonialists leave.
Right.
It takes time for the new country to find its own feet and its own expression. So that happened in that generation. And it's the generation of transition.
Right.
And that makes it interesting.
Your latest book, The Golden House, I just finished it. Very rich cornucopia of stuff in that book. America as a cauldron of both creativity and disruptiveness for these Indian characters, the patriarch and his 3 sons. He's a gangster, which is, you've had gangsters before in your fiction. Fascinating character. I'm wondering about the germ for this. Where did this come from?
Well, it came from 2 places on opposite sides of the world. I mean, it is, in a way, there are 2 cities of this. It's a kind of story, a tale of 2 cities, I suppose. But the beginning of it didn't happen in New York at all, even though that's where the novel now takes place. It happened in India, because in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in Bombay in 2008 on the Taj Hotel and other places, I mean, I became very, that's the kind of 9/11 of India, if you like, that event. And so I obviously became very interested in it and tried to dig around to see what had happened and why and how and so on. And I got involved in examining this very interesting nexus between the jihadists coming from Pakistan and the criminal mafias based in Bombay. And I just thought, if I can put a character in the middle of that, the middle of that strange triangle of great wealth, criminal mafias, and jihadists.
That's fascinating.
That would be an interesting place to put a story.
But the 4th piece was also that they're erudite people.
Yes.
They're educated. You don't expect that. I mean, you don't expect that from The Godfather.
No.
They know things, and they are artists and intellectuals and so forth, including the father, and that adds another layer to it. That I think it's very.
Well, see, because I think those very wealthy families in India, they are often very highly educated, and he gets drawn into the mafia. He's not actually a mafia don. He gets drawn in and then wants to get out.
Yeah.
And goes to this enormous lengths to change everything and re-establish himself halfway around the world. In order to try and escape the trap that he's entered. And of course, a novel being a novel, he's not going to succeed.
Can't do that. Yes. And then you have the spokes of the children, the sons, who are each one so interesting. You deal with so many au courant issues in that novel: autism, identity politics, the art scene, gender identity.
Yes. Well, I really wanted to. I wanted the book somehow to reach out for what was in the air, and what people in this, roughly speaking, decade
it's a
have been
hip
thinking
novel
about.
in that sense, and I was thinking about this. You're not a youngster.
No.
But you're hip, I guess.
One of the deliberate choices in the book was to have a narrator, the young filmmaker Renee.
Yes.
From a completely different generation than myself. I mean,
and an American.
And an American.
Yeah.
And it's the first time I've ever done it.
Really?
To have a narrator. I haven't always had a first-person narrator, but it's the first time that the central figure was a born and raised white New Yorker, of 25 years old.
And a filmmaker. Which is the most.
So he became really fascinating. I loved writing him because he was so other than myself, but he's also very idealistic and troubled about his country, and ambitious, and a little bit ruthless in the service of his ambition. And he's interesting.
He's an interesting character. He's been compared to Nick Carraway in The Great
But
Gatsby, which I think is an interesting
But
comparison.
the difference is that Nick Carraway would never join the story. He was always.
I don't want to give a plot point away and do something very dramatic.
But he was always the observer, Nick.
Absolutely.
And the story of Gatsby and Daisy and so on is happening over there, and Nick's over here watching. But in this case, Renee.
He's drawn in.
He didn't want to remain just an observer. There's a crucial moment in the book when he crosses that boundary.
Right. We don't want to give that away.
No, we don't want to give it away. But so he becomes a crucial part of their story. So that differentiates him from just simply the character standing on the sidelines. I think there's a moment in the novel where he thinks of himself as Nick Carraway, but he isn't.
Well, he's a more active character.
He's more active.
I interviewed your friend Christopher Hitchens before his death, and it was one of my favorite interviews of all time. I believe you share his views about religion.
Oh yeah, about that. There are plenty of things that Christopher and I disagreed about.
Yeah.
But religion wasn't.
He was
one
moving
of them.
toward the right in some areas.
Yes.
Did you quarrel with him over that?
Oh yes, we argued about it a lot. Now that was one of the things about Christopher is you could have the argument. You know,
You could always have an argument.
you could
with
have
him.
the argument, and
Yeah.
it didn't really affect your friendship with him. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I strongly disagree. At that moment when he became slightly too close to the kind of Wolfowitz-Cheney gang.
Yeah, he supported that war. Yeah.
I thought that was. I mean, I wasn't able to understand that really, and many of his friends, many of his closest friends, argued with him constantly about that. But in fact, I used to, because then he wrote the book, the God book. You know,
God is not great.
And I mean, I'm an atheist as he was, but I said to him that in a strange way, God had rescued him from the American right. because of course those people
would never support
would
that
never
position.
support that book. So and in a way, that book took him away from that Cheney.
But he never
Wolfowitz.
would have become fully. I mean, I think what I admired so much about him was that he was in no way an ideologue. You could not predict.
No,
where
he was
would
very
fall.
much his own man.
Yeah.
But I think the God book gave him, in a way, took him away from his connection with that very conservative part of Washington, and kind of gave him back to his natural constituency. You know?
Okay. You have taught at Emory and now at NYU, and your students are, I assume, very well versed in postcolonial theory. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, the theorizing that now surrounds this postcolonial, and if you teach that, if you talk to that, what's your thought?
I avoid theory.
You avoid theory, because you're a novelist?
Yes, I think I don't want, you know, there's that famous essay that Tom Wolfe wrote back in the day called The Painted Word, in which he argues about the art world, that the theory is beginning to come before the practice. You know, that people, instead of criticism and theorizing arising out of the work that artists are making, that there would be the theory first and then art would be made to.
Do you think we're at this point now?
And I wouldn't want that to happen to my writing, is what I mean.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I wouldn't want to become so drenched in theory that the books become expressions of the theory. You know?
Now, let me ask it in another way. Do you feel your books are political, have political agency to them?
I think one has to be very careful about overclaiming. You know, I think novels very rarely have any serious political agency. You know, I mean, I thought that the Satanic Verses was the least political of my novels. You know, and I thought
it was misread. I think that's part of it.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
But you know, what I mean is that sometimes a book can have an impact in the world which the writer is not able to foresee.
Absolutely. You know, you're a progressive. I mean, there's no apologies for that in the way you talk about things. And yet you have been criticized for objectifying women, both in your work and in your life. Do you have any response to critics who say that?
I mean, I think, you know, there's plenty of responses to that by many women critics, you know, so I don't have to respond.
Okay.
I mean, because actually I'm really proud of the women in my books. I think they're strong and vivid, and it comes out of the fact of having grown up in a very female family. You know, I mean, I have 3 sisters and no brothers.
Oh, really?
I have, you know, in the extended family, many more female relatives than males. I've always grown up in the company of women.
So it's in the eye of the beholder.
And well, I'm saying that there are, you know, there's all kinds of snippiness out there, but I'm really, there's no need for me to respond to it because I think these books have a lot of passionate women readers.
So one last question, since we're out of time. So what are you looking forward to receiving the Nobel Prize?
Oh gosh, no, you can't think about prizes. You know, I mean, I've had, you know, I've had a lot of.
You've had a lot of prizes.
I've had the good fortune to receive lots of awards here and there, you know, and I've had lots of experiences of being on the losing end. You know, I mean, it happens. You know, when Midnight Children won the Booker, there's a panel of 5 judges, and and there were 3 judges who voted for it and 2 who voted against it. So
And then you were shortlisted several
yeah,
times.
And sometimes it was just the other way around. You know?
Right.
So, I mean, if you win, it's nice. If you don't win, it doesn't matter. You know, because the point is, it's not why you do it.
You're doing it for the fiction.
I mean, I'm much more. I think of it as a much greater prize that these books continue to be alive. You know, that Midnight Children is what, it's now 36, 37 years old, you know, and the fact that there are still young people in universities and elsewhere, people who weren't born when the book was published, who find it, you know, relevant and interesting. That's why you do it. You want these books to endure, you know, you want the books to be there longer than you are.
Yes.
And when they show signs of doing so, that feels much better than, you know, some kind of medal.
Well, I think you've written quite a number that will endure.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you very much for being with us today, Salman Rushdie.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel interview.